In the summer of 1938, the Beilhartz family of Denver, Colorado, set out for a holiday trip that should have been filled with nothing more than laughter, rest, and the fresh mountain air. They were a large family, 10 children in total, and Alfred Edwin, at just 4 years old, was the youngest. He was small, lively, and curious, the kind of child who never strayed far from his siblings, yet often darted about with bursts of restless energy. The Beilhartz family chose Rocky Mountain National Park as their destination. Established only 23 years earlier, the park had quickly become a favorite for families seeking the escape of high-altitude meadows, rushing creeks, and pine forests. The Beilhartzes weren't strangers to the outdoors. They were used to camping and hiking, and this trip was one of many they had taken into the Colorado wilderness. That first week of July was a popular time. Visitors poured into the park for the Independence Day holiday. Campsites were crowded, and the weather was warm and clear. Tourists waded into rivers, fished along the banks, and hiked the park's many trails. But with beauty came danger. Rocky Mountain streams were notoriously fast and cold, swollen by snowmelt, and the terrain, though inviting, was rugged and unforgiving. On the morning of July 3rd, 1938, the Beilhartz family broke camp and made their way along Fall River, near a cascade known as Horseshoe Falls. This was a spot where families often picnicked and children played near the water. Alfred walked with them, toddling along behind his older brothers and sisters. He was dressed for the outing, and his parents, though managing a large family, kept glancing back to make sure he was keeping up. Somewhere along that trail, in the bustle of 10 children and adults, Alfred slipped from view. The family later recalled that he had been seen only moments earlier. One second he was there, trailing along behind, and the next, he was gone. At first, there was no panic. Children ducked behind trees, chased after chipmunks, or got distracted by the rushing water. Surely, he would come running back in seconds. But seconds stretched into minutes, and then minutes into long, uneasy silence. The family fanned out, calling his name. His brothers scrambled through brush and around rocks. His parents moved along the creek, searching for any sign, a splash, a footprint, a rustle in the undergrowth. Nothing answered. The sound of the rushing Fall River drowned out their voices, as if the forest itself swallowed the boy whole. By the time other visitors realized what was happening, concern had grown into dread. Alfred was nowhere to be found. The Beilhartzes reported the disappearance quickly, and by that evening, word spread across Rocky Mountain National Park. A 4-year-old boy had vanished in broad daylight. What began as a family hike was about to erupt into one of the largest and most baffling search operations the park had ever seen. Welcome to Criminal Mind Tales. Today, we revisit the haunting disappearance of 4-year-old Alfred Beilhartz, a case that has puzzled investigators for over 8 decades and remains one of Rocky Mountain National Park's darkest mysteries. If you want to follow more stories like this, real cases that twist, terrify, and remain unsolved, make sure to hit subscribe so you never miss the next chilling story. The alarm spread quickly through Rocky Mountain National Park on July 3rd, 1938. A boy of only 4 years old had vanished in broad daylight, just a short distance from his parents and siblings. Park rangers wasted no time. By that evening, a coordinated search was underway. The terrain near Horseshoe Falls was rugged, marked by sharp rocks, steep embankments, and the fast-moving waters of Fall River. The most immediate fear was simple. Alfred had slipped, fallen into the current, and been swept away. With that in mind, searchers began dragging the river with grappling hooks, probing beneath the surface for any trace of the child. But nothing surfaced. As night fell, the search expanded. Rangers called in volunteers, tourist campers, and local residents who dropped what they were doing to join the effort. Lanterns flickered to the trees, their glow cutting across the darkened forest as men and women scoured the banks, shouting Alfred's name into the rushing roar of the river. His parents stood by, desperate for answers, their hope waning with each hour. By morning, the search had grown. Over 100 men combed the area, their lines stretching across meadows and forests. Bloodhounds were brought in, their noses pressed Alfred's clothing before being set loose to follow the scent. The dogs darted forward eagerly at first, weaving across the undergrowth, but soon lost a trail. No clear path emerged. The boy had vanished without leaving so much as a footprint. Officials began to map out every possibility. If Alfred had wandered off on his own, the dense pine forest could hide him easily. A child of 4, barefoot or lightly shod, could not have traveled far, but even a short distance in such terrain could spell disaster. Coyotes, bears, and mountain lions roamed the park. The elements themselves, cold nights, steep cliffs, the swift current of the river, posed their own dangers. Still, there was reason for hope. Many children lost in wilderness areas are found within hours, frightened but alive. Searchers widened their sweep, calling out, listening for cries, straining for any sound that might lead them to Alfred. Nothing came back but silence. Day after day, the search continued. Rangers dragged not only Fall River but also the nearby streams, refusing to believe a body could remain hidden for long. They checked eddies, pools, and fallen snags where debris collected. But the river yielded nothing. No clothing, no shoe, no small body caught beneath the current. The absence of evidence gnawed at search leaders. If Alfred had drowned, surely some trace should have surfaced. If he had become lost in the woods, bloodhounds should have found his scent. If he had fallen, someone should have discovered a trail or disturbance. But after days of effort, there was nothing. The search became one of the most extensive Rocky Mountain National Park had ever seen. Over 150 people joined in, moving in coordinated lines, sweeping mile after mile of terrain. Yet the result was the same: empty forest, rushing water, and a growing sense of unease. By the end of that first week, the disappearance of Alfred Beilhartz had shifted from a hopeful rescue mission into something darker. The possibility of an accident was still on the table, but another thought began to creep into conversations, one no one wanted to say aloud at first. What if Alfred hadn't simply gotten lost? As the days dragged on, the urgency around Alfred's disappearance grew. By the end of the first week, the search for a 4-year-old boy had transformed into a massive operation. Rocky Mountain National Park had never seen anything like it. Rangers called in reinforcements from nearby towns. Soldiers, Boy Scouts, and experienced mountaineers joined volunteers in covering mile after mile of wilderness. Aerial searches were even attempted. Planes from the Colorado National Guard flew over the park, scanning meadows, ridges, and riverbanks for any sign of movement or discarded clothing. On the ground, searchers carried sticks and probed the undergrowth, looking for depressions, small tracks, or any clue. Each time they thought they'd spotted something, a patch of disturbed soil, a bent branch, it dissolved into nothing. Alfred seemed to have disappeared without leaving a trace. One of the strongest possibilities remained drowning. Yet, despite constant dragging of Fall River and Horseshoe Falls, nothing surfaced. Rangers kept returning to the same grim task, convinced that the boy must have been caught somewhere underwater. But with every fruitless attempt, doubts grew louder. The bloodhounds provided no comfort either. Experienced handlers tried repeatedly to restart the trail using Alfred's clothing. Each time, the dogs began eagerly, then faltered, circling aimlessly before giving up. There was no consistent direction, no lead to follow. Search leaders were baffled. Scent should have lingered in the still air and damp ground. But it was as if Alfred had simply evaporated. The pressure on the park rangers mounted. Newspapers picked up the story, and headlines about the missing Denver boy spread across Colorado. The Beilhartz family, desperate and sleepless, watched strangers comb the forest, hoping for the smallest discovery. Days turned into a week, and hope began to clash with dread. It was then that reports began to surface of something strange, something that pulled the investigation away from the simple explanations of drowning or becoming lost. A group of hikers reported seeing a small figure high above in a remote area known as Devil's Nest, a craggy outcropping miles from where Alfred had vanished. They described a child who looked to be sitting with 2 men before being pulled back out of sight. The location was baffling. For a boy of 4, Devil's Nest was nearly impossible to reach. The climb was steep, the terrain unforgiving. It was not a place where a child would simply wander. Yet the witnesses insisted on what they had seen. Rangers rushed to investigate, scaling the cliffs and combing the ledges. But by the time they reached the spot, there was no one there. The report couldn't be confirmed. Some dismissed it as a mistake, a trick of distance, or perhaps another camper's child. But for others, it raised an unsettling possibility. What if Alfred hadn't vanished into the river or the trees at all? What if someone had taken him? The official search continued for weeks, expanding further and further into the wilderness. Teams scoured trails, ridges, valleys, and streams. Every logical explanation was tested, every theory followed. But the more they searched, the less sense it made. By mid-July, the search had grown into one of the most exhaustive in Colorado's history, and still, not a single trace of Alfred had been found. And then, just as hope seemed to be dimming, a new twist emerged, one that would plunge the case from tragedy into something darker. By mid-July 1938, the disappearance of Alfred Beilhartz had become front-page news across Colorado and beyond. The massive search effort, the unexplained lack of clues, and the haunting sighting reported at Devil's Nest had left investigators with more questions than answers. For the Beilhartz family, days had stretched into weeks with no sign of their youngest son. Their grief was visible to everyone who passed through the search command posts. It was during this period of uncertainty that a chilling development reached them. A letter arrived, one that sent waves of hope and dread to the family in equal measure. It was a ransom note. The message was straightforward. Pay a sum of money, and Alfred would be returned safely. The details were vague, but the intent was clear. Someone was claiming to have the missing boy. For Alfred's parents, the note was a cruel mixture of possibility and fear. If it was real, it could mean Alfred was alive, taken but not lost to the river or the wilderness. If it was false, it was nothing more than a vicious exploitation of their suffering. Investigators handled the letter with utmost seriousness. Every ransom demand had to be considered, no matter how unlikely. Authorities examined the writing, the phrasing, and the method of delivery. Police departments across the region were notified, and the FBI was made aware. The possibility of an abduction for ransom scenario had to be weighed carefully against the already exhaustive evidence pointing toward accident or misadventure. But as experts looked closer, the cracks in the story began to show. The note contained no proof of life, no details about Alfred's clothing, his condition, or the circumstances of his disappearance. Details only someone who actually had the child would know. The demands were generic, the writing clumsy, and soon the truth became unavoidable. The ransom note was a hoax. Someone, somewhere, had deliberately inserted themselves into a grieving family's nightmare for personal gain or twisted satisfaction. The cruelty of the act shook the Beilhartzes, who had been clinging to any sliver of hope. For a brief moment, they thought Alfred might still be alive, waiting for them. That fragile possibility was ripped away as investigators dismissed the demand as fraudulent. The revelation didn't just crush the family, it complicated the investigation. Now, rangers and police had to contend with public perception. If people believed Alfred had been kidnapped, the search might lose focus. If they dismissed abduction outright, they risked overlooking something vital. The ransom note, though proven false, left a mark. It underscored how vulnerable and desperate the family had become, and how cases like Alfred's often attract not only genuine volunteers and good Samaritans, but also opportunists willing to exploit tragedy. Meanwhile, the search on the ground continued. The woods, rivers, and ridges yielded no answers. No body, no clothing, no trace. And as July wore on, the lack of resolution began to gnaw at investigators. If Alfred had drowned, why was there no evidence? If he had been lost in the wilderness, why hadn't the search turned up even the smallest clue? And if someone had taken him, as the Devil's Nest sighting and ransom note seemed to suggest, how could they have vanished without leaving a trail? By the end of the month, the case had shifted from an urgent search to something else entirely, a lingering mystery that refused to fit into any explanation. By late July 1938, nearly a month had passed since Alfred Beilhartz vanished on that sunny morning near Horseshoe Falls. The Beilhartz family, once surrounded by volunteers, rangers, and the noise of constant activity, now faced the quiet of a search winding down. At first, every effort had carried the urgency of rescue. Searchers moved quickly, calling Alfred's name, scouring every trail and stream as if he might be found alive at any moment. But as days turned into weeks with not a single trace, the tone shifted. The men probing the riverbanks no longer expected to hear a child's cry in the distance. The lanterns carried into the forest each night no longer symbolized hope, but grim persistence. Park officials faced a painful reality. If Alfred were alive, he could not have survived this long in the wilderness. At 4 years old, with no food, no shelter, and no way to endure the cold nights, his chances would have ended days after his disappearance. The mission was no longer rescue. It was recovery. Still, even recovery eluded them. Creeks had been dragged dozens of times. Forest floors had been swept clean by volunteers walking shoulder to shoulder. Ridges and cliffs had been scaled. Devil's Nests searched again and again. But Alfred's body, his clothing, or even the smallest belonging was never found. This absence made the case all the more unsettling. In most wilderness disappearances, evidence eventually surfaces. A shoe washed downstream, a scrap of fabric caught on a branch, or a small body discovered weeks later by hunters or hikers. But with Alfred, there was nothing, only silence, only questions. Theories circulated among investigators and the public. Many believed the most likely explanation was that Alfred fell into Fall River and was swept away. The water was powerful and cold, capable of carrying a child downstream. But after weeks of dragging and probing, the lack of a body troubled even those most convinced by the scenario. Another possibility was that Alfred had wandered far from the family trail and succumbed to exposure. But could a 4-year-old truly travel such distances without leaving tracks or scent? Search leaders doubted it, though they could not rule it out. The Devil's Nest sighting and the ransom note, though the latter proved false, kept alive a darker possibility, that Alfred had been taken. If that were true, he might never have been within reach of the searchers at all. But no suspects emerged, and no credible evidence supported the idea beyond speculation. The Beilhartz family remained in limbo, caught between hope and despair. Without a body, there was no closure. Without answers, there was only endless imagining. Did Alfred slip silently into the river? Was he alone and afraid in the woods as the searchers passed by? Or was he pulled into the hands of strangers, far from the trails his family had walked that morning? By August, the official search was scaled back. Rangers returned to routine duties, though they remained watchful for any sign. Volunteers went home, exhausted and disheartened. The park emptied of search parties, leaving behind only the echo of unanswered calls through trees. What had begun as a family holiday had turned into a national headline, and now into a mystery that refused resolution. Alfred's disappearance was no longer an active hunt, but a haunting question mark that lingered over Rocky Mountain National Park. And as weeks turned into months, the story of Alfred Beilhartz slipped into legend, an unsolved case that left investigators puzzled, the public unsettled, and a grieving family without peace. By the late summer of 1938, the case of 4-year-old Alfred Edwin Beilhartz had spread far beyond the valleys of Rocky Mountain National Park. What began as a family's private tragedy had become a subject of intense public fascination and unease. In Denver, Alfred's hometown, newspapers followed every development. Headlines reported on the massive search effort, the mysterious sighting at Devil's Nest, and the cruel hoax of the ransom note. Front pages carried photos of Alfred, his small face staring back at readers who tried to imagine how such a young child could vanish so completely. For parents, the story was every nightmare come to life. Families who regularly visited the Rockies began to see the wilderness in a different light. Hiking trails, once thought safe for children, suddenly seemed treacherous. Rivers appeared more dangerous, cliffs more menacing. In living rooms and cafes, conversations circled back to the same chilling question. How could a boy disappear in a crowded national park, in daylight, with so many people nearby, and leave nothing behind? The mystery gained traction outside Colorado as well. Regional and national outlets picked up the story, emphasizing its eerie elements. The fruitless searches, the baffling lack of evidence, the possible sighting of Alfred miles from where he vanished. In an era when missing children cases rarely gained such wide attention, the disappearance of Alfred Beilhartz stood out. As coverage spread, theories multiplied. Some readers believed wholeheartedly in the drowning explanation. Others latched onto the idea of abduction, pointing to the reported sighting at Devil's Nest as proof that foul play had occurred. Letters poured into newspapers and authorities, offering both sympathy and speculation. A few even claimed psychic visions of Alfred's whereabouts, though none proved useful. For park officials, the publicity was double-edged. On one hand, it kept attention on Alfred's case, ensuring no stone was left unturned. On the other, it painted Rocky Mountain National Park in a darker light. What had been a symbol of natural beauty now carried the stain of a child lost without explanation. Officials found themselves balancing the ongoing search with efforts to reassure the public that the park was still safe for visitors. The Beilhartz family endured the spotlight with quiet grief. They had not sought public attention, but now their private pain was shared across headlines. Each article, each speculative theory, each false lead kept their wounds open. For them, the media coverage was both a lifeline, keeping Alfred's name alive, and a torment, forcing them to relive their loss daily under the gaze of strangers. Even as weeks turned to months, the case did not fade entirely. Journalists revisited the story periodically, particularly when other children went missing in wilderness areas. Alfred's disappearance became a reference point, a grim example of how even the most innocent family outing could end in inexplicable tragedy. The public, meanwhile, remained divided. Some believed firmly that Alfred had drowned and that his body had simply been missed. Others were convinced something far stranger had taken place, whether abduction, foul play, or some darker, unexplainable force within the mountains themselves. By autumn of 1938, no new evidence had surfaced. The search had officially been scaled back, yet the case lived on in whispers, speculation, and printed words. Alfred's story was no longer just a search operation. It had become a mystery that unsettled the public imagination and cast a shadow over one of America's most beloved parks. And for investigators, the lack of answers was as haunting as the public fascination. With every headline and every unanswered question, the case of Alfred Beilhartz slipped deeper into the realm of the unsolved, a place where fact and speculation blended uneasily, and where closure seemed increasingly out of reach. By the fall of 1938, the search for Alfred Beilhartz had officially wound down. Rangers, exhausted from weeks of fruitless effort, returned to their normal patrols. Volunteers went back to their families. The lanterns that had lit up the woods at night were extinguished. What remained was silence, and an absence that could not be explained. For the Beilhartz family, the pain was unrelenting. Without a body, there was no funeral, no place to grieve, no sense of closure. Alfred had simply vanished into the wilderness, leaving behind only memories. The family's return to Denver was marked not by resolution, but by unanswered questions. Every holiday, every family gathering carried the weight of a missing child whose fate was never determined. In the official records of Rocky Mountain National Park, Alfred's case was left unresolved. Rangers listed him as missing, presumed dead, but even that presumption carried little certainty. For park staff, the case remained one of the strangest disappearances they had ever encountered. Many had searched tirelessly and could not shake the feeling that something about this case defied explanation. As time passed, the story faded from front-page news but never disappeared entirely. Each summer, when families returned to the Rockies, whispers of the missing boy resurfaced. Hikers near Fall River sometimes told newcomers a story, a child who vanished on a bright July morning, never seen again. Guides would gesture toward Horseshoe Falls or Devil's Nest, recounting the eerie details. Alfred's name became a cautionary tale in the oral history of the park. Theories lingered. Some continued to insist on drowning, despite the lack of a body. Others quietly leaned toward abduction, citing the Devil's Nest sighting as the most compelling detail. A few suggested that Alfred had wandered deeper into the backcountry than anyone imagined, his remains swallowed by the wilderness. But none of these explanations satisfied all the facts, and the case remained open-ended. In the decades that followed, Alfred's disappearance took on new life in discussions about unexplained vanishings in America's national parks. Authors writing about strange cases would point to 1938 as one of the earliest examples. For some, Alfred became a symbol of the wilderness's unforgiving nature, a reminder that nature does not yield its secrets easily. For others, his case was evidence of something more sinister, that people, even in crowded places, can vanish without a trace under circumstances that defy logic. Meanwhile, his story continued to haunt Rocky Mountain National Park. Rangers in later generations, when asked about unsolved mysteries, often brought up Alfred's name. His case stood apart, not just for the tragedy of a child lost, but for the eerie absence of evidence that made it impossible to explain. For the public, Alfred's disappearance became part of a wider cultural anxiety about wilderness safety. Parents kept a closer eye on their children during hikes. Visitors viewed rivers and steep trails with greater caution. And in local folklore, the story of the 4-year-old who vanished in the thin air lingered like a shadow over a park. By the time decades had passed, the Beilhartz case was less a current investigation than a mystery folded into history. Yet, unlike many old cases, it refused to settle quietly into the past. The unanswered nature of Alfred's disappearance ensured that each retelling stirred the same questions, the same unease, and the same grim fascination. The long-term impact was clear. Alfred Beilhartz was not just another missing child. His disappearance became part of the dark tapestry of unsolved cases in the American wilderness, an early example of how even the most innocent day in nature could twist into something unexplainable. And as the years wore on, his case did not just linger. It began to attract new voices, new theories, and new audiences far removed from the summer of 1938. By the 1960s, Alfred Beilhartz's disappearance had receded into the dusty archives of Rocky Mountain National Park. Officially, the case remained unsolved. Unofficially, it was remembered by rangers, locals, and historians as one of the park's most haunting mysteries. For the Beilhartz family, the absence of closure persisted like a wound that never healed. Alfred had become a ghost story within his own family, never spoken of in detail, but never forgotten. But history has a way of resurfacing. In the latter half of the 20th century, interest in unexplained vanishings within national parks began to grow. Outdoor magazines occasionally revisited lost child stories, and researchers began to compile cases that shared unusual similarities. It was during this cultural shift that Alfred's name reemerged from obscurity. Writers investigating strange disappearances cited the Beilhartz case as one of the earliest and most perplexing examples. Alfred was not lost in a remote canyon, nor was he the victim of a known animal attack. He had vanished near a well-traveled area in broad daylight. The details, his sudden absence, the alleged Devil's Nest sighting, the fruitless search, fit the unsettling pattern of cases where evidence simply refused to appear. In the 1980s and 1990s, Alfred's case began appearing in compilations of wilderness mysteries. Some authors described his disappearance in purely factual terms, sticking closely to contemporary reports from 1938. Others leaned toward speculation, treating Alfred's case as an unsolved riddle with potential sinister undertones. The ransom note, though proven to be a hoax, was often retold in these accounts as a chilling reminder how tragedy can invite exploitation. By the 2000s, with the rise of television specials and later internet forums, Alfred's story reached an entirely new audience. True crime enthusiasts, hikers, and mystery seekers debated what could have happened. Was the Devil's Nest sighting genuine or misidentification? If Alfred had drowned, why was there no trace after the creek was dragged? Could an abductor really have acted so swiftly and cleanly in a crowded park? The lack of closure invited endless theories. On online message boards, hikers and amateur sleuths dissected every detail of the case. Some insisted Alfred's disappearance was a tragic but ordinary accident. Others leaned toward the extraordinary, framing his case within broader discussions of strange vanishings in American wilderness areas. For these readers, Alfred was no longer just a boy lost in 1938. He was a symbol of the wilderness's darkest mysteries. Documentary makers, too, took note. Several productions on missing persons in national parks included Alfred's story as one of the earliest documented cases. His name stood alongside later more famous disappearances, giving his story renewed life in the modern imagination. Yet despite the retellings, the central truth remained unchanged. No body, no clothing, no trace of Alfred was ever recovered. The facts were as stark in 2000 as they had been in 1938. All that had shifted was the way his story was told. In modern retellings, Alfred's case had become almost archetypal. A child, innocent and full of life, vanishes without warning in a place where families expect safety and beauty. The search is exhaustive yet fruitless. A lead surfaces, only to collapse under scrutiny. And decades later, the questions linger, refusing resolution. Alfred Beilhartz's disappearance no longer belonged only to his family or to Rocky Mountain National Park. It had entered a wider cultural memory, one that treated the unexplained as both tragedy and enduring mystery. And as the 21st century deepened, Alfred's story would find yet another home. Among those who study the most unsettling patterns of all, disappearances that defy explanation across national parks nationwide. By the time the 21st century arrived, Alfred Beilhartz's name had become more than a historical footnote. His disappearance was no longer confined to old newspaper clippings or the fading memories of Rocky Mountain locals. Instead, it became part of a larger, unsettling conversation about the sheer number of people who vanish each year in America's national parks. Every summer, millions visit places like Yosemite, Glacier, Yellowstone, and Rocky Mountain National Park. Most return with photographs and memories. But each year, a fraction never comes back. Some accidents are explained: falls, exposure, animal encounters. Others remain mysteries. Among those mysteries, Alfred's case, dating back to 1938, was often cited as one of the earliest examples of a child vanishing under circumstances that resisted explanation. Writers and researchers began noticing strange patterns in missing person cases within federal lands: disappearances in broad daylight, sudden vanishing with no tracks, and searches that turned up nothing despite exhaustive effort. Alfred's story checked every one of these boxes. This connection drew Alfred's case into discussions surrounding the missing 411 phenomenon, originating from the work of researcher David Paulides. Missing 411 explore clusters of unusual vanishings across national parks and wilderness areas. Paulides and his readers identified cases where people disappear with little or no trace, often under odd circumstances. Alfred's disappearance, though it happened decades before, became one of the reference points in these discussions. It's important to note, official agencies like the National Park Service and law enforcement do not recognize missing 411 as a formal category. They treat each case as unique, often pointing to accidents, wildlife, or human error as explanations. But the public fascination with these cases has kept stories like Alfred's alive in a way ordinary archives never could. In this context, Alfred's story is retold with a kind of eerie resonance. He was hiking in a populated area with his family. He had been playing near a creek, just steps away from relatives. He was gone in moments. Dogs could not track him. Searchers found no trace. And when a possible lead appeared, the sighting at Devil's Nest, it offered more questions than answers. The similarities to later cases were chilling. Some saw Alfred's disappearance as the first thread in a much larger tapestry of unexplained vanishings. To others, it was a heartbreaking example of how easy it is to underestimate the danger of wilderness for a child. The controversy lies in how the story is framed. For historians and park officials, Alfred's disappearance is a tragedy with no clear evidence of foul play or mystery beyond the tragic unpredictability of nature. For those drawn to the missing 411 framework, it is one of the most enduring and troubling examples of how people can vanish in ways that resist explanation. Either way, Alfred Beilhartz's disappearance has become more than a singular event. It is now part of a collection of stories that define public perception of America's wild spaces, not only as places of beauty and freedom, but also as landscapes that can swallow a person whole, leaving behind no answers. As these discussions grew, Alfred's story reached audiences far removed from Colorado, his name now linked to a phenomenon he never could have imagined. And yet, even as it entered these modern conversations, the central truth remained unchanged. A child had vanished on a summer morning in 1938, and his fate had never been uncovered. The mystery of Alfred Beilhartz was no longer just about him. It had become a symbol, woven into a larger narrative of the wilderness as a place where the line between safety and danger, presence and absence, life and death, can be thinner than anyone dares to admit. The summer of 1938 has long since passed. The newspapers that carried Alfred Beilhartz's name are yellowed and brittle, tucked away in archives. The voices of the rangers, searchers, and family members who scoured the Rockies for him have fallen silent. Yet, nearly 9 decades later, Alfred's story remains unresolved. No body was recovered. No clothing was found. No conclusive evidence ever surfaced. In the coldest terms of official records, Alfred Beilhartz remains missing. But in the human heart, his story is something much more, a wound, a riddle, and a haunting presence that refuses to fade. Rocky Mountain National Park still welcomes millions of visitors every year. Families walk along the same trails the Beilhartz family once did. Children laugh and play near streams, their parents calling after them with familiar words of caution. Stay close. Don't wander off. Most of the time, those warnings are enough. But for some who know Alfred's story, the echoes of 1938 are impossible to ignore. The place where Alfred vanished is ordinary. A creek, a trail, a backdrop of granite cliffs and pine forests. Yet it is this ordinariness that makes his disappearance so chilling. He was not in some remote wilderness, cut off from help. He was surrounded by people, in broad daylight, on a holiday weekend. And still, he was gone in seconds. Theories endure. Some hold the belief that he drowned, though the absence of evidence casts doubt. Others believe he was taken, by a stranger or even by someone known. The sighting at Devil's Nest, whether real or mistaken, adds a layer of eeriness that has never been peeled away. And still others suggest that Alfred simply wandered too far, too quickly, swallowed by the wilderness before the search could close in. But none of these theories can answer the most haunting truth. Alfred was never found. His disappearance stands like a stone lodge in the stream of history, unmoved by time, unshaped by resolution. For the Beilhartz family, the loss was personal and devastating. For Rocky Mountain National Park, it became one of the earliest and most enduring mysteries. And for the broader public, Alfred's case is now part of a darker narrative, an emblem of how easily the wilderness can turn from beautiful to merciless, how swiftly the familiar can become unrecognizable. Nearly 90 years on, his story lingers not because of what was found, but because of what was not. In the silence where answers should be, there's only speculation. In the space where closure should exist, there's only the shadow of a boy who once laughed and played near a creek on a summer day. Alfred Beilhartz's disappearance is not just a case file or a newspaper headline from 1938. It is a reminder of the fragility of certainty, of how quickly the ordinary can fracture into the inexplicable. His name remains, not in resolution, but in absence, an enduring mystery that continues to echo through the trails, forests, and rivers of Rocky Mountain National Park. And perhaps that is the most unsettling truth of all. Sometimes the wilderness keeps its secrets forever. Nearly 90 years later, the case of Alfred Beilhartz still has no ending, no answers, no closure, just a boy who vanished into the wilderness, and a family left with questions that echo across time. His disappearance has become legend, an eerie reminder that even in places of beauty, darkness can strike without warning. Sometimes, the wilderness keeps its secrets forever. What do you think happened to Alfred Beilhartz? Was it an accident or something far stranger? Let us know your theories in the comments below. And if this story left you haunted, subscribe to Criminal Mind Tales for more real-life mysteries that will keep you awake at night.